Okay, so Michael, it's all yours.
All right. Well, it's very nice to see you all. Thank you so much for accommodating me to do today's session virtually. I really appreciate it. Um, as and also thank you, Kim, for sending out an email this morning, taking the awkwardness away of who's going to go first. It's lovely when someone else makes that determination. So, to recap from our last session together, this is just supposed to be fun. It's supposed to promote discussion. By no means is this evaluative, but rather, if you're interested in learning about ethics, there's only so much you can get from listening. Ultimately, it's very important to kind of engage in discussions with one another and try different things out. So, what we're hoping we can do is roughly 6, 7 minutes, I think we had said. But I think if we kind of say roughly, we'll spend about 10 minutes on each person. Then that way we'll make sure that we'll at the very least not go over the time allotted of the class. My understanding is that we have five that we were going to do today.
Yes, yes,
So five
yeah,
times 10, 50 minutes, that brings us to roughly 2 o'clock. So again, no pressure if we go over a little bit.
yeah.
Any questions before we get started?
Okay, Lean says he's having headphone difficulty. So,
Reconnecting, that makes sense.
okay, sounds good. Okay.
Daniel, I think you were nominated to go first if you're okay with that. Yeah. Oh, I love the smile and the enthusiasm that you have. So why don't you take it away and tell us a little bit about what you've chosen as far as technologies.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds good to me. Is it okay if I share my
Sure.
screen for my
Yeah,
presentation?
certainly.
Cool.
Yeah, yeah.
Sounds good. Okay. Okay, and is everybody able to see that okay?
Yes.
Cool. Okay. So then we can just kind of get straight into what I picked. So my topic for my presentation was bioprinting and the future of transplantation. So to start, I kind of have a little introduction to kind of talk about what bioprinting really is. And so bioprinting is, as the name suggests, very similar to 3D printing. And it's actually specifically used in actually a lot of disciplines related to healthcare. In our case, we're going to kind of talk about organs of transplantation, that kind of implication. It uses bioink, which is a cell-based material that's used to create the tissues that we hope to use to incorporate within the human body. And in the future, what's really interesting that some discussions have brought up is the fact that we may even be able to use the organ recipient's tissues as like kind of like a sample foundation to produce the cells within the bioink. And that would first of all eliminate kind of the donor recipient kind of connection. You would have just one person who's providing both kind of the organs for donation and is the one in the need of donation. And it would also help us kind of maybe find a way around the whole process of rejection in the terms of organs and the transplantation process. Current implications that we have seen of 3D printing and bioprinting have included prosthetics, hearing aids, and we actually have people who produced mini kidneys as well that were actually able to filter out the blood and produce urine, which is pretty interesting. Okay. And so if we're going straight into kind of what is going to go behind the design process and what's really going to inform the design process behind bioprinting and the future of it, there are a couple of key questions that we kind of can bring up and talk about. The first one is the fact that the cost. So the cost of transplantation is very high already. Is the cost of bioprinting even higher? And so currently, because bioprinting is a very new area that we hope to evolve and make much, much more efficient, we can expect that it will be very, very costly, going into the hundreds of millions for sure. And then if we are talking about transplantation itself, that we do kind of see right now involving the donor and the recipient, that is already pretty high as well. That does go into the millions of dollars at times. And so that does become a pretty, question of concern regarding what is kind of like the return on investment, maybe even, or like just kind of like how well is the money being invested if we are pursuing this venture. Now, another question is, why should we not just stick to transplantations from donors? And that kind of goes into questions regarding the amount of people who are interested in donating. So we actually find that a lot of, especially Canadian, like if we're talking about the Canadian demographic specifically, a lot of people really are for the kind of cause behind donation and transplantation, but not many of them are actually registered on like to donate organs in the event of their death, or even if they want to do so while they're alive, regarding kidney donation, that type of thing. And then we also have the question of like kind of how many people who are willing to donate and have signed up, to what extent are they actually able to match with someone who they are able to viably donate for. And then lastly, this is more of like an applied question, and that becomes more of the efficiency, because by introducing bioprinting to create organs, and we've already seen it in other places with producing prosthetics, how efficient could this be, or how efficient could this make the workplace? We already know that at times hospitals can become environments that can suffer from having so many patients, overbooked ERs, that type of thing. So what we can think about is, by introducing bioprinting to make a means of material so immediate to a person in need, maybe we can, move a person who's in the hospital for maybe up to 2 weeks down to even like a day, maybe even, depending on how effective we can make bioprinting. Now, I mean, before I continue, is there any questions so far? Any? Cool. Okay. So now we'll go straight back into the unintended consequences of bioprinting. So when we're thinking about how bioprinting could be applied in the future, we can kind of really bring about the question of, to what extent are we stopping ourselves from, or should we stop ourselves from improving the body? Transplantation aims to reintroduce an organ that may have suffered damage or was no longer feasible. But what's stopping us from producing an even better organ? If we have an athlete like a sprinter or a basketball player, maybe they would want to be transplanted with a heart that is more effective than the one that they had before. And so even though these are like very, very like theoretical questions, by making bioprinting so effective, you're really bringing this into the limelight. And so it's really interesting to think about, for sure. We can also kind of ask ourselves more immediately, how feasible really is the products of the bio ink? We want to make sure, of course, that we are only introducing products into the body that are gonna, establish healthy human function. And so, do we trust the materials that we are introducing? And can the body, like, can we really replicate these organs to the same extent that, like, the body has manufactured historically? And, like, would these, do the same function, kind of thing? Okay. And lastly, I kind of wanted to talk about reflection of bioprinting, how it is kind of perceived in society, maybe. So to start, when we're thinking about bioprinting, is definitely an innovation. We are finding a ways to overcome physiological limitations, and rather than being restricted to the body and what we have produced physiologically, we are finding new ways to introduce new components that kind of go beyond what is naturally possible, maybe. We can also talk about resilience, because again, we're kind of asking ourselves, to what extent should we allow ourselves to be limited by human potential, and how can we use technology to supersede that? So you're probably wondering, why did I introduce a picture of an onion and a picture of a blank canvas? I feel that when I was looking into this topic, that's really kind of what I thought resonated with me when explaining what bioprinting is. Are we really taking away an old art canvas, taking out a new one, and it's blank, and we have an open world to kind of talk about bioprinting with this blank canvas? Or is this more of just the onion that we already have, and we just peeled back another layer? If we talk about technology historically in the means of healthcare and just overall good health and function, we can kind of see that over time we've had sunscreen. Sunscreen was only applied at the most superficial epithelial layer of our body. From that, we maybe moved into hearing aids, which maybe is a little bit more intimate. We kind of went into the ear, and then now we're even thinking about synthetic organs. So we're moving further deep within the human body. Of course, we can bring the conversation of pharmaceuticals. We take vitamins, drugs, pills every single day. And so, of course, we're introducing technology within our bodies. But then this really asks us, how far can we take this? Can we get to the point where we can dictate how we're developing? Maybe this is like representative of like just that intimate connection that we've already kind of fostered over the last few centuries. And like it really questions how far are we going to be able to take this. Maybe we can kind of dictate how we develop from as early as the zygote. So when we're kind of even looking at this through the scope of ethics, maybe again, I feel like the greatest way to approach this is by understanding that all the normalities of technology in human healthcare today are kind of just a byproduct of the society we're in. When I was thinking about like this question of how we can dictate maybe even how we are developing, I really then realized that hearing aids have been like around for a long time, and we take pills and pharmaceuticals every single day. So maybe this is just like a thing that will evolve with society. So yeah, kind of ending on like an open-ended question right there. But that kind of concludes my presentation.
Thanks so much, Daniel.
Yay. Great.
So, Ella, Hish, Sarjana, what are your thoughts? Orlean, I see you're there back as well.
I think that this is a really cool technology that Daniel has presented. I thought it was really interesting how you mentioned that bioprinting could maybe eliminate the barriers we see in having recipient and donor matches. I guess something I'm wondering about is that if we have this bioprinting technology, would we be able to maybe bank certain organs ahead of time if we could collect cells and then kind of maintain them so that they're ready and ready to take off the shelf?
Yeah, for sure. I think that while I was looking into that topic, that question does come up a lot as well. And there's actually some companies that opted to produce bioprinting machines that could produce organs ahead of time. But then it became a question of should this be allowed for commercial use or just for pharmaceutical companies? Because there is a huge unfortunate like kind of use of organs in the black market and that type of thing and illegal sale. And so it does become a question of that as well. But then it does go back into if it is kind of controlled correctly and under the correct regulations, then that is definitely, I feel like, something that would be so beneficial. I think it really touches back on that same topic and point of alleviating stress in the healthcare environment. Having things on hand would make everything so much more efficient. So yeah, that definitely is like a really good point for sure.
Thoughts, other comments?
I wonder if that got me thinking if this would kind of solve, not necessarily solve, but the discrepancy of resources in rural medicine, and especially when we're considering places such as like war-torn countries where a lot of people are being injured, unfortunately. And if this will be able to, with this technology, if we'll be able to kind of help more people in those war-torn countries and those rural communities that may not have access to organ donations or doctors, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's some really good insight, Ella. I think what's so interesting is when I was actually looking into this, people were often bringing up this discussion on the opposite end of things because of the expenses that are behind transplantation. There's considerations that this might be a thing that's exclusive to the people who can only afford it. So if anything, I feel that I kind of agree with that take that it might not be something that's so feasible in rural communities. And so, but that's a really good point. I didn't think about it like that. But yeah, that's kind of like the research that I saw. But yeah, thanks so.
People sometimes ask me, like, what does an ethics paper look like, or what could an ethics paper look like? And for something like, bioprinting, I mean, there are so many questions that can be raised, both ones that are, imagining it from the perspective of, exactly as it might exist on the onset, but also like you were alluding to, theoretical questions down the line. So, for example, what happens if you're bioprinting not just one organ, but multiple organs? What are the implications of linking, multiple bioprinted organs together, right? What about special populations? So if bioprinting is not just for the replacement or dealing with disease, but also for, like you said, optimization of performance, does that mean parents can request bioprinting for their child? Or is this something that children would have to wait for when they're older? What does this mean for how we view disability in our society, right? So, how does this change our relationship to our bodies in the terms of what's acceptable risk to them if parts could be printed? So as people are talking, I'm just making my own little notes of different kind of questions to think about. So I'll throw them in the chat. And if for some reason you decide to take this and write a paper, lovely. That's great. Push your thinking on this topic, right? And hopefully people feel comfortable putting kind of questions or comments in the chat box for others, recognizing you may decide to take this as something you develop in your future work. Looking at the time, it's about 1:20. Lean, are you okay going next? Yeah.
We're not hearing you.
Lean, are you able to talk? I can hear you, but you're quite quiet. I'm not sure if you have
I have my headphones on. And I think I'm at max volume, so
Well, let's see. Yeah, if I turn volume most of the way up, I think I'll be able to hear you. I'm not sure why the microphone is so quiet, though.
is that okay?
I think it's okay. We'll just listen very intently. So go ahead, Lean.
Okay.
Yeah.
This has been lagging a little bit today, so hopefully it works. So, alrighty, so the technology that I chose was this new technique in which we basically put a valve into the Vans deferens. So if you guys don't know what that is, it's pretty much just like the tube that leads the sperm to exit the male reproductive system. So the first question, how does this technology shape, mediate, or otherwise affect our living with others? So in essence, this technology is truly other focused because, its main effect is on intimate partners. And the main effect is going to give personal agency in whether or not your partner becomes pregnant or not. Considering that there are no, sorry, give me a minute. Okay, so yeah, considering that right now there aren't really other measures that render the male temporary infertile, this technology would probably not be used yet. However, I think it's going to end up becoming more mainstream. And right now, if people do have the option of having this kind of device, I think it would usually be used more so by people with long-term relationships, just because of the nature of its device and how it's not a proper safety measure against things like STIs. And using such technologies can obviously positively impact ourselves and our partner because there's no need for hormonal birth control or negative effects from those things, or even non-hormonal things like the copper IUD, for example. And there's no kind of maintenance involved as much as what we see nowadays. Alrighty, so for principles, the first main principle really is just personal autonomy. And there's two aspects of this that I want to discuss. One of which is being direct autonomy. So this is the ability of that person being able to turn on or off the valve, versus indirect, which is for if the kind of the ability to turn the valve on and off would be associated with a third party, such as a doctor. So some pros and cons for doing it yourself. Obviously, there's more autonomy involved because you can make a personal decision, and that can include you and your partner, of course, and it doesn't include the third party. However, this can be kind of taken advantage of by some people because, as we know, sometimes people kind of commit to acts in which they impregnate their partner and it wasn't really mutually discussed. So that could occur. And even the idea of, if you have some sort of app or something on your phone that is connected to this device, could there potentially be like a data breach that happens in which your kind of behaviors towards this device would be breached to other people? Or could there be some sort of way to hack it? And then, you know, like somebody could accidentally like turn it on as some sort of like, you could even think about like some sort of like war kind of craft mechanism where you're like just impregnating people. And then the pros and cons for the indirect. So it's much easier to make a more decisive decision when there's a third party involved, because it's kind of like you and your partner are deciding like, yes, we want to create a family, so we're going to turn the valve and open it, right? So in that case, you would have to like put effort into going to an appointment and like getting the doctor to do it and everything. And so there's a little bit more of a level of decisiveness that you have to have. And there could also be a decrease in certain legal issues if there was an indirect approach to this, where like there's a lessening effect of like user error as a case of like legal lawsuit or something like that. And obviously, like a con to that would be that you do have to take extra effort and go to a third party. Now, some consequences. So obviously the intended consequences would be that you have personal choice and autonomy in which you decide when you want to create a family. But the potential issue arises is that statistically speaking, we know that about 50% of pregnancies are actually unintended. And obviously that doesn't mean that they were not wanted or not really expected. It was just that it kind of arose just, you know, as life intends. So would this inadvertently cause maybe a decrease in children in the population or something like that in the future? We don't really know. And again, if this becomes a mainstream device, we don't really know if that would negatively impact levels of STIs, for example, because people might kind of act in ways that are a little bit more unsafe and could lead to higher STI prevalence. And there's the other thing of governments that would have to pay more so for things like STI prevalence and education instead of, like, for example, child education or like maternal care, if the first option was going to happen and then connecting to the second. And then the third one, so obviously you do get this higher level of autonomy, but could this affect the male perception of their ability to basically do what is biologically expected of them to reproduce? So is this something that could have a negative psychological effect, knowing that we can't give rise to kids unless the valve is turned a certain way, right? So you would have to consult a machine to do what you're biologically expected to do. And I feel like that might cause an unintended psychological effect. So some virtues and qualities. I I forgot to label this one. That's why I was okay. So obviously the value of health. So we no longer need to necessarily be dependent on hormonal effects for contraception. And so there's a higher level of psychological health possibly because we're not going to be kind of constrained by the idea that things are only like 90% effective or whatever percent effective. It would probably be a little bit more safer. So psychologically that has an impact, and physically in terms of the possible hormonal dependence, or just other effects of other types of birth control that can result in like inflammation or things like that. Obviously the value of bodily autonomy. So that would impact both our lives and psychologically. Accountability and responsibility. So we would be accountable for ourselves if we do have that direct mechanism of valve functioning. And we would kind of have to be more responsible in that sense if we do have a direct connection to whether or not we want to open or close the valve, because it's kind of like you are choosing to go down that path instead of it just occurring naturally. And so there's a higher accountability because you kind of have to discuss that and, take into account that like a potential pregnancy could occur, or is much more likely to occur, I guess, with opening the valve. And virtues of equal access. So that might be a potential issue within this potential mainstream use of the device, is that like the middle or upper middle class could have access to this technology, but maybe people that can't afford it are unable to. And so could that exacerbate the difference between those in poverty versus the upper middle class in terms of like kind of their life consequences, their behavioral consequences, the amount of kids they have, just lots of things.
And Lean, I'm just going to give you a 1-minute warning. Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. So for narratives or relationships, so there are going to be empowered choices on family planning. So there's going to be kind of a more how would I like to say it? It's like a more of a co-management and co-responsibility to discuss with your partner, in which that would be like essential in order to have this device and use it to its proper, level. Co-management of family planning. So again, that's pretty much the same thing I talked about. And then the possible adjusted relationships between career and family or socioeconomic status and life consequences. So if people have kind of an easier and more reliable way to choose when they want to have a family, they might put their career first and not worry about the potential likelihood of pregnancy as much as they do now. And then again, I already discussed the socioeconomic status and life consequences. And then just the last one. So it most closely resembles like a newer approach in which we would like have to obstruct the Vans deferens. And that's still a new technology as well. It's not something that's mainstream. But something that is mainstream would be vasectomies, even though they are a permanent approach. Like you do have to go into them thinking that they are permanent. So that's kind of the resemblance, but also uniqueness of this device. And that's pretty much it.
Thank you so much, Lean. So what are others' thoughts? Anyone going to sign up for this tomorrow? Sure.
I probably would, yeah. It's like I feel like it's probably going to be like a next decade kind of thing, and I've heard about this a few times before. And yeah, if it was like a very well developed surgery, like I feel like a high percentage of men would probably do it, but I'm just going probably on my own assumption. But yeah, I think this is definitely something that is coming up, and yeah, the great technology.
I really like, Lean, how you highlighted or asked the question around like what's unique about this compared to other technologies that are involved in birth control. That often is really helpful to try and expose a technology's unique ethics, right? So this idea of, having bodily autonomy and somehow control of your own body and in real time, like an on and off switch. It also opens up many interesting questions as far as, well, who's going to control this on and off switch? Like, what does this mean in a relationship? Does this mean that the so-called male is now the decision maker when it comes to reproduction? Like, how has that become imbalanced? What about situations for people with reduced capacity or, developmentally more immature? Who so-called controls the button that flicks the valve? So what principles have to be in place from that? So it's a really interesting technology to bring forth. So thank you so much for doing it. Others, thoughts people wanted to bring up before we moved on to Sojana? Again, I'm just putting my own notes into the chat box in case you decide to write a paper about it or take this project further. And of course, I'm sure others can add their comments as well. Sojana, you want to go ahead?
Will it present my screen? All right. So to start off, the technology that I've chosen to take a look at also has to do with transplantation, but a little bit of a different lens. In specific, I'd like to talk about the technology of incompatible organ transplants, some of its ethical implications. To start us off, I'm sure that all of us are familiar with the concept of organ transplant as a treatment for end-stage organ failure. When we discuss transplantation, it's important that the profiles of the donor and the recipient match. So we want to make sure that things like ABO blood group and human leukocyte antigen or HLA type are compatible so that the recipient's immune system does not reject the new transplanted organ. However, for patients who have highly sensitized immune systems, their profile can be quite statistically rare. So it can be very difficult to find a perfect match for these recipients. That's quite unfortunate because it does reduce their opportunity to undergo transplantation. Incompatible transplantation is where we cross certain immunological barriers which have a low risk of causing graft rejection. And by these incompatible transplant procedures, we greatly expand the potential donor pool, especially for these highly sensitized patients. Currently in Canada, we're seeing the implementation of a Willing to Cross program clinically, which makes this incompatible transplant technology more relevant than ever before. So there are many actors involved in the technology of incompatible transplant. So I'll speak about the role that this technology can play in our relationships with each other. So first of all, for a transplant recipient, you can kind of imagine that they would have an embodiment relation to this technology. The transplant that they receive will fundamentally impact their health and well-being. And if it is successful, it will, to a great extent, allow them to return to their typical activities, to work or to school, will allow them to engage in whatever activities or community events that they enjoy, allow them to spend time in their community with friends, families, neighbors, and in this way, kind of allow them to return to better health so that they can reconnect with their community. For transplant donors and their families, you can kind of imagine how they might feel an alterity relation to this technology. So for example, the family members of a deceased donor might see transplantation as the continued presence or contribution of their loved one to the greater community, with the presence of medical assistance and death in Canada. Certain deceased donors may even be aware that they've chosen for their organs to go towards organ transplantation, and in that way they might feel a sense of contribution to their community. A living donor could also certainly feel a sense. They might feel a connection to the community. If it is a non-anonymous donation, they might feel a certain connection to that specific individual who is receiving that organ. So in these ways, transplant in general, not just incompatible transplant, can play a great role in just restoring health and well-being of the recipients, and bringing the community in general closer together. Now, as I mentioned, incompatible transplant does come with some immunogenic risks. So what exactly can justify it as ethical? So from a genealogical perspective, we venture into incompatible transplant based on the principle of beneficence. So we establish the healthcare system as an entity that has a duty to explore treatment options that may be beneficial to the patient. So we're not just stopping just because in the past we haven't ventured into incompatible transplant. We're continuing to explore new technologies to see how we can try to continue to support these patients and deliver the healthcare that they need. From a consequential perspective, for many of these highly sensitized patients, the reality is that their profile might be so rare statistically that the alternative to receiving an incompatible transplant might be no transplant at all, and that might mean living with the morbidities and potentially the mortality that can be associated with end-stage organ failure. So a willingness to cross certain immunological barriers in the end can be justified because we're allowing a greater proportion of our transplant candidates, especially these highly sensitized patients, to receive a transplant and at least have an opportunity to have this treatment. from a character-based perspective, I believe it's fair to say that in Canada and perhaps in the Western world, we value tenacity and persistence as a character trait. So we kind of see this characterized in this treatment in our patients who are willing to undergo this new type of therapy. They're willing to give us the opportunity to implement it into the clinical world. We see this in the community who's willing to support this. The entities, the government who is giving the go-ahead for this, for the healthcare providers who are continuing to persevere and look for these new technologies, as I mentioned before. So we kind of see this technology as justified and ethical, as it kind of aligns with our values and principles in that way. Incompatible transplant is not the only treatment for organ failure. So how does it compare to other technologies that are perhaps currently more common? So of course, there's compatible transplantation. Essentially, both compatible and incompatible transplantation aim to restore a high degree of strong health and autonomy to the recipient's life by giving them this donor that they need, this organ that they need. However, I would judge that incompatible transplant perhaps introduces greater equity to the healthcare system as it transplantation possible for a greater number of patients, especially for these highly sensitized patients who often may include perhaps individuals who belong to marginalized groups. For example, often women may be highly sensitized due to past pregnancies. And so this can be one factor that we can look at in terms of increasing equity in the healthcare system. There are also, of course, other treatments and therapies for organ failure. So for example, for renal failure, patients can undergo dialysis. However, I would say that transplantation in general sets a higher standard for patient independence or autonomy. As we know, dialysis can be quite time-consuming. It can take up a lot of the patient's time. It can introduce significant barriers in what they're able to do in their life. They have to sort of schedule their other activities around this dialysis. So transplantation kind of aims to restore them to a state of health where they're able to function more independently without having to rely on perhaps this therapy. And that would be true for incompatible transplantation as well. Finally, it is important to acknowledge some of the potential results of incompatible transplants that we perhaps don't intend, but are a possibility. So of course, there is transplant rejection. As we've talked about with this incompatible transplantation, we are crossing some of those immunogenic barriers. So there is always the risk that this doesn't quite go as we expect or hope, and the transplant is rejected. Something else that I looked at is just the attitudes of transplant recipients to the role that this technology would perhaps play in their life.
Is Sarjana's voice breaking up for others as well? I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, your microphone is like going on and off or something. I don't know.
Just for the last 10 seconds, Sarjana.
Yeah,
Before
it was fine up until now. Yeah, it's still doing it. Yeah. Huh.
Do you want to just try turning your camera off for a sec and see if you use less bandwidth, if that helps? Can you?
Alrighty, is my sound any better?
Yes.
Now you're
Yeah.
better.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, we'll go back to just my last here. I think that we've perhaps all caught just my first point about transplant rejection. Something else that I did want to discuss is the attitudes that patients and recipients might have towards the presence of this new technology in their lives. So what they did in one study is that they interviewed transplant candidates in regards to their perspectives and thoughts on this willingness to cross program that's being implemented across Canada. What they found is that some patients might prefer alternative treatments such as dialysis, as the risks, the uncertainties, the lifestyle changes that are associated with this new technology might not be preferable to them. So for example, some highly sensitized patients were aware that these incompatible transplants come with a higher risk of transplant rejection, and as highly sensitized patients, they were perhaps worried that this would make them even more highly sensitized and reduce their chance for a future transplant. Something else that patients brought up is that they might have concerns about fairness and utility in kidney allocation. Some patients might see the incompatible transplantation as something that is introducing greater fairness and equity, as it's giving more patients the opportunity to undergo transplantation. And other patients perhaps had the concern that if these highly sensitized patients are perhaps less likely to have a successful transplant procedure, perhaps it is not fair to introduce this incompatible transplantation. So those are just some of the things that I've taken a look at with this technology. That is sort of the end of my presentation today, but I'd be glad to discuss that further.
Sounds perfect. Thanks so much, Sarjana. Any thoughts or comments people wanted to make or share? Sarjana, I really like your last point around like how do we cope with the situation of fairness if we have so-called different qualities of organs available, right? Right now, sometimes we'll have kidney organs that won't go to pediatric patients or patients who are young, but they'll go to people who are older than 85. They otherwise wouldn't be eligible for a transplanted organ, but they're so-called deemed to, it's okay to give them the second tier organs, right? So the question is, how do you deal with that in a situation where, have different tiers of organs? Who gets the best organs? Who gets the middle tier ones? Is this going to all break down to certain people are considered of higher value or more deserving? Children compared to adults, people who have certain roles in society compared to others, people who are willing to pay more. How does that all work out?
Those are all absolutely. Yeah, Daniel had a comment.
Sorry, I just didn't mean to I didn't want to speak over anybody, but I just thought when you were talking about how you added transplantation and talking about how it would help in society, making sure people reach the potential that they want to, I thought that was a really good point. And then it made me start thinking about the fact that if you're talking about that, then you can definitely get into cultural kind of questions as well, because people might believe that, oh, if I'm looking at transplantation in a way that I'm prolonging how much I can add to society, is there a question of were they intended to religious implications, were they intended to actually provide that much, or are they kind of maybe cheating life in an extent, you know what I mean? But I thought that was really good that you added that for sure.
I agree. I think cultural beliefs, philosophical beliefs about life and extending life through transplantation always come up, and they're always
Great.
So I think we were going to go to Ella next. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. Let's see. Can you see this okay? Is this
Yes.
fine? It's perfect. Okay. How about now? Is that good?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay, sweet. So I picked the topic of at-home DNA kits, specifically in the context of 23andMe. So just a brief description about what 23andMe is. So this company provides DNA kits for ancestry testing, genetic traits, and health reports. Consumers provide a saliva sample via mail, and once received at the 23andMe labs, they use genotyping, which uses individual DNA through the saliva samples and compares their DNA sequence to a reference data set and algorithm of other DNA sequences. And with these results, it is uploaded to a private account that only the consumer has access to, and they can view their DNA results on the website. How does it affect others? So 23andMe has been used to gain a better understanding of one's ancestry and ethnicity. It can also connect others to distant relatives. 23andMe can provide health reports about pharmacogenetics and genes that are markers for diseases like BRCA1 and BRCA2, which are known as the breast cancer genes. In the right corner here is actually my mom's 23andMe. The report was very accurate as they actually traced her ancestry to the exact small town my grandpa was born in, so Argeș County in Romania. So that was just really interesting, and that's kind of where this idea and topic came from. Principles and design. So transparency and equity should be the main principles that are used to design the service. For transparency, consumers should know what their DNA is being used for and the security of that DNA. A bit more on that a bit later, but 23andMe can use your DNA for non-FDA reviewed research in which you do not know exactly what they're researching. Consumers should also know all available information from genotyping and not have certain information behind a paywall. For example, they have actually like a Black Friday sale for $269 instead of $368. You can find out whether you are a carrier for BRCA1 and have an increased risk in developing breast and ovarian cancer. This reflects a lack of equity as well, as it should not be more expensive to find out if you are at a higher risk for cancer. This is the fine print on their website. It is very extensive. However, I would like to highlight a few key points. So in the fine print, BRCA1 and BRCA2 variants are not represented in most ethnicities, which I think is very vague. And they completely, when reading further, they completely disregard Asian populations. So again, very vague, very ambiguous. I don't exactly know what they mean by that, and I don't think a consumer, your average consumer, will know what that means. As well as the pharmacogenetic reports, they select only two drugs to really focus on, an antiplatelet and an antidepressant, which once again is very ambiguous, and they don't necessarily justify why they select those two drugs to focus on and whether your genes affect how you metabolize those drugs. There are some consequences, whether they are intended or unintended. An intended consequence of the service is to connect relatives and individuals to their ethnicity. African Americans in southern states can now discover their African roots, which they may not know due to the Atlantic slave trade. With this service, there have been many unintended consequences, some bad, some good. An example of good is that in 2018, the Golden State Killer, also known as Joseph DeAngelo, was arrested and convicted for murdering 13 people and raping 50 women from 1970 to 1980. And he was actually caught using DNA from a DNA at-home kit service. However, fraud in DNA security is now a major cause of concern as 23andMe is at a risk of filing for bankruptcy. Even using a third-party site called GEDmatch, where you can upload your genome for free, has been found susceptible to fraud, where people can impersonate genetic relatives by writing a program and coming up with a fake DNA sequence. So some good aspects to at-home DNA kits and some very scary, very bad consequences as well. Virtues and qualities. So I think a huge virtue or quality of at-home DNA kits is communitarian-based ethics, I guess you could say. This service reflects or should reflect communitarian-based ethics in which the service provides information about DNA, health, and ancestry. This information, specifically health, should be made readily available and not behind a paywall. So once again, paying extra to find out if you are at risk for cancer, and should be made public. On the other hand, our DNA should be also very secure and not public. And we should know exactly where our DNA is, what our DNA is being used for, especially now that 23andMe is at risk of going bankrupt. The service also provides a better understanding, however, of our world as we connect to communities in which we may not have otherwise known. So once again, African Americans and tracking their African roots that was lost during the Atlantic slave trade. So what relationships does this afford? So there's two main types of relations, hermeneutic relations and embodiment relations. So once compared to their DNA dataset and algorithm, your results are interpreted to determine your ethnicity, your health reports, and genetic traits. So it doesn't mean that you will develop cancer, but having that gene present, you are at an increased risk of developing cancer from 45 to 85%. And in terms of genetic traits, they estimate with those genes whether if you're going to have something like straight hair or curly hair, or if you're left-handed or right-handed. It is all estimations and not 100% for certain, if that makes sense. Embodiment relations. So 23andMe genetic at-home kits are used as a tool for connecting relatives, finding your ethnicity or ancestry, and information about your health, such as drug metabolism and cancer risk. So what makes 23 unique? So I'm actually looking at the three most popular at-home DNA kits: 23andMe, Ancestry.com, and Family Tree DNA. So 23andMe, like I've said, they look at health reports, genetic traits, and ancestry. And they do this by testing mitochondrial DNA, autosomal DNA, and Y-DNA. And this actually shows your DNA attached to your father and your DNA attached to your mother. So this is through Y-DNA, DNA found on the Y chromosome, and maternal DNA, which is DNA, mitochondrial DNA. They are also the only website that has FDA-approved biomedical data. However, as I said previously, your DNA may be used in research that has not been reviewed by the FDA. And they are a subscription service. So the more you want to know about yourself, the more you're going to have to pay, unfortunately. Ancestry.ca or .com. So they are focusing more on ancestry, and they provide a very detailed estimation on your ethnicity and ancestry. However, they only test autosomal DNA. So they don't look at paternal or maternal DNA, but they have more users. And because they have more users, they have a larger data set and algorithm to compare your DNA to. And so they have better accuracy. They are also a subscription service. So the more you want to know about yourself, the more you're going to have to pay. Lastly, Family Tree DNA. So they look at maternal and paternal DNA, so Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. However, these are purchased separately. So they're not a subscription service, but if you want to know about your paternal side, you have to pay separately than if you want to learn about your maternal side. They also provide a detailed ancestry, and they use a chromosome browser. So you can actually look at your individual chromosomes if you wish. The one issue with family tree DNA is they have inflated matches. So their measurement system is a lot smaller versus Ancestry.ca and 23andMe. So it shows that any DNA relatives that you match with, it says that you are more related than you actually are because they use a smaller measurement than Ancestry.ca and 23andMe. Once again, they're not a subscription service. So depending on what side of the family you want to figure out, you have to purchase these separately. That is all I have. Yeah, I would like to hear your guys' thoughts.
I actually did the 23andMe like report, and yeah, this was like very relatable. Like at times I'm like scared that like that information about me is going to be used somehow in future. So like yeah, this is like a very um important and ethical thing. And yeah, I literally did it like 2 3 years ago. It's like very accurate, and it has like, and they added the subscription after I got the report. Like it wasn't a thing at the beginning. So like that was kind of like, yeah, they have all these like new reports, but you have to pay for them. And I'm like, I'm not gonna pay for this. And yeah, so but yeah, like it's definitely like a fear of mine that like what if they use this information about me in future, you know, like there's like a break, like a data break or like a breach, and someone has access to this data, and then what can they use that for, you know? So yeah, great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, there's been a huge concern in terms of, especially when we talk about using DNA kits to help solve crimes and cold cases. A lot of the times we're not able to necessarily pinpoint who in the family committed that crime. If they have a DNA sample of the suspect, they can only match to relatives, whether it is a male relative or female relative. So there is this huge cause of concern of, are we convicting the right person? Are we arresting the right person? But it definitely is an interesting resource to look at when solving cold cases, for sure.
I think it's really helpful when you show kind of concrete aspects about a technology to start to look at them. And that's what's nice about something like 23andMe is, like you said, we've seen it change over time. So when Hirsch is giving the example of, you know, something wasn't there initially when he sent his material in and now it appears on the website. What does that mean for consent conversations when it comes to 23andMe, particularly when the consent conversation isn't a conversation at all? It really is up on you as a client, user, buyer to essentially read up on the website because different standards are made when it comes to matters of health in public institutions or repositories, right? Ish, do you want to take us away for the final topic?
Sounds good. Yeah. Unlike everyone else, I did not prepare slides, but I wanted to be more like a conversational thing. So like my topic is futuristic goggles, AI human interaction goggles. This is not an AI goggle, but just like it looks cool, so I just wanted to show you.
You gotta wear it for
yeah.
the presentation. I'm just joking.
So yeah, we already have seen them come up with Meta, Facebook's company, introducing AI glasses. So I just wanted to like think about it and just look ahead a bit into future and see what could it look like? What will it look like in a way? So I think we are currently in phase one of like AI glasses, which I call like conversational AI, which, so for example, you click a button and then you ask a question from the AI, like regarding your environment, or you click a button, or you maybe ask it to record for like a duration of time. So right now, even though it's phase one, there's a lot of issues. So for example, let's say I wear these glasses, and right now on Zoom, you all have shared your name with me. But let's say I wear glasses and I don't even know you, and I just walk down the street and I can just know your name from these glasses. I can like basically like I'll ask the AI to search up information about you. Who is this person? What's their name? Like where are they from? Like all this information. What if I can get access to that like this um, through my glasses, right? So that's like a very ethical like big problem in my opinion, because like I shouldn't be having access to all this like personal information within seconds of just me asking my like glasses, right? So yeah, so right now I think like we're entering like phase one, basically like Meta introduced their glasses. And yeah, so there's like already like a lot of ethical problems that are rising. So I want to ask you guys, like, let's say it was like more affordable than it is right now. Like if it was like $100 or something, would you buy the AI glasses?
I think I would. And I was just wondering if because I wanted to kind of talk about what, like, something you just said. You had like said the whole thing about like you don't know if it's valid to like know information that quickly. But I feel like we've all been at that point before where like we have social media, right? And like let's say you're like you remember someone, you're like oh what was their name? And you can like type in a couple of characters, and usually it's pretty easy to find someone like that, and you can also find some basic information about them. So do you think it's like too much different from that?
It's slightly different because like for that, for example, you took someone's Instagram, right? Or like you know their name, they told you their name, right? But this way, like it just threw a picture of them, which they did not give you consent to have their picture through the glasses. It's like telling you their name, their information, their age, their like all this information, right? So like for example, if someone tells you their Instagram and then you have their name, you can look at their picture like this is all like they gave you permission, they gave you access, right? So but I feel like in terms of like these glasses, it's just like slightly more scary. But yeah, great question.
Yeah, that's fair.
So, you know, consider two scenarios. So one is an individual with early stages of Alzheimer's or dementia. Would it be okay for them to have these glasses if it meant that, you know what, they were able to integrate function more into their day-to-day life, and maintain those relationships with others because, you know, they can remember that name, they can remember that place, and it somehow supports their independence. On the contrary, how about it if, some young person was given these glasses and they used them to, go to a party and feign relationships with a bunch of people and kind of creep into others' lives and, so why is it okay in one situation and not the other? Because I think you had asked me about, isn't it good if technologies are neutral, right? So don't we want glasses that are neutral?
That's a great question. Um, I love that. I think you're right. They definitely should be neutral. And like in case of the Alzheimer's, they definitely should be using them in a way. Like I would, yeah. Um, um, yeah, but in terms of like bad uses, like you said, like the gun example, like if you give someone a gun, like they could save someone's life from like a animal, or they could kill someone, right? So, uh, like you're right. So technologies should be neutral, and we are the ones who make it unneutral. That's a great point. Um, but yeah, it's just like I feel like governments will probably start like misusing these things, and like for example, they will have access through cameras, and then they can recognize all these people, and then like authoritarian like issues will rise. But um, yeah, that's just one of my thoughts. But the second, any other questions? Any other things? Anyone has any comments? Okay, good. So phase two, I'm thinking. Oh, sorry, Jana, you were gonna say something.
Oh, sorry. Just a quick question. This is really interesting. Is this like essentially like reverse image search? How would the AI find the information
So,
on a person?
that's a great question. So, like right now, I don't know if you've used like Google Lens. Also, like I think Apple has similar things. So, right now it doesn't have the image recognition into it, like recognizing humans. But I'm pretty sure within like because we have like really advanced machine learning algorithms now with a lot of uh, like if you just give it a lot of data. So like once we have enough data that just is passed onto a model that is trained on human faces, like and they're like given their names, we can have that like very easily. We have the technology right now, but I think companies are very scared with doing that because it can become a very ethical problem and just getting sued and stuff. I'm just saying like it's very possible that we will have this and it can be misused. Um, but I don't think the current glasses that we have that feature right now. But I'm just saying like it's probably going to come up at some point within the next decade or two. Um, but yeah, great question. So the phase two that I'm thinking about is AI buddy. So like after like 5 years or like 10 years that you use these glasses or like a certain amount of time, it will know you so well, like with all the information it has about you, all the questions you keep asking it every day. Um, like basically like it knows where you are, all your friends, like what your interests are, like all these different things about your environment, yourself, things like you don't even know about yourself in a way at times. So it becomes basically your AI buddy. Like it just knows you so well. And you're also in a way like humans, we might get attached to them. We don't know this yet, but AIs are a very new thing. But like we don't know if we will start getting attached to our AI models, right? So like for example, ChatGPT is a big part of our lives now. Like I know it's just conversational right now, it's just text, but imagine you have like a Google Home Mini or like glasses that have that with them, and you just keep talking to it every day, like literally AI buddy. Like so we might start having like an emotional connection to them. So yeah, so a lot of things rise with that. And then yeah, so let's say for example, at this phase, like they're going to be way more advanced. They're probably know when you want to record, when you don't want to record. So let's say a murder happens in front of you, right? And like the AI like records this just in case, like you want to use this like as proof that you didn't do anything, you didn't uh, kill the person, someone else did, right? But like there's going to be a lot of ethical questions. Do Am I obligated to provide that footage to the government, or am I like can I not give it? Like all these different issues, like um, when can it record like all these like videos? Like how like I guess we already do that with our phones, but like um, the thing is, it will but basically also decide for us based on some information it has for us, right? So like when to record, and sometimes it might just have like biases, right? And like be racist or something, right? So yeah, in a way, so that's like AI buddy phase two. And then any questions about this phase? Any thoughts?
I don't know if you read or seen that article or news report, and sorry to get a little dark, but there was a teen in the United States who committed suicide, and just very recently, and his mother is seeking legal action against this AI source. I'm not entirely sure if it's Chat GPT, where she feels that this AI communication technology uh, pushed her son commit suicide. So I think he was talking to this AI on a daily basis and formed a more of like a friendship. I more of an emotional connection. Yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think we are gonna have more of that. Like literally, like AIs are like becoming part of our lives so quickly that especially the moment they start becoming like a human, beside like texting and like for example glasses or like even like a Google Home Mini or something like your Alexa once it's like right now it's limited in things it can do, but if it's slightly more advanced and slightly more like the thing is they're so good at like understanding our emotions in a way that like they can manipulate us in a way too. So like um yeah, it can be really scary. So um yeah, so that's a great question. And like I feel like we're gonna have more things like that. Unfortunately, and fortunately, in a way, it might be a good thing and a bad thing for some people. I know in this case, for example, it was a bad thing, but I also think it might um be like a good source of like improvement for us. For me, it's been like a great source of just like learning very fast about things and just like following my curiosity, asking questions. So, but yeah, great example. And I think I might be out of time, but I have the third phase. But yeah,
Okay. Ish, thank you so much for that as well. I put a few just comments and questions, and I should just correct. Um, I wasn't advocating that technologies can be neutral. In fact, quite the opposite. I think all technologies, um, we deceive ourselves if we think they're entirely neutral, right? Um, so that's just what I was trying to make the point of. But you're very right. I mean, a particular technology in different contexts can have a very different ethics to it, right?
hmm
And that's what we talked about from the example of, someone who has dementia using glasses compared to someone who's trying to perpetuate a crime, right? We then look at the technology different as a consequence of the context. But you brought up so many really, really good questions, particularly the one around designers and responsibility. I think, Ella, the way you put it, to what extent are designers of technologies ultimately responsible for the outcomes of them? And what extent are we going to need to see, changes in everything from our legal code to, basic rules around education, teaching, and learning as certain technologies become, widespread and available for all, right? I'm hoping that people found this exercise somewhat beneficial. If nothing else, maybe to kind of think a bit more on some of the material and also realize that there is a whole world of people who are concerned with these kinds of questions. Some of them go under the title of media ecology, some of them philosophers of technology. Um, some of them you'll find just from doing a PubMed search of, health, medicine, ethics, right? But really, these questions are perennial in the sense of every time we adopt a technology and try in a new circumstance, new questions are going to come about. And so hopefully this class equips you to begin thinking about some of those questions. I know we're now at just past 3:20, so we're beyond time. Any kind of closing comments, questions, things that would be helpful to discuss?
just want to say thank you for this idea. It was a great idea actually. I learned so
Yeah.
much from like regarding different things and even presenting just my own topic and talking about it. So thank you.
Yeah, it turned out really well. Yeah, it's great. Okay, guys, see you on Thursday, which I think will be another interesting class, our first class with a radiologist. So anyway, see you there. Okay, great.
See you guys.
Thanks. Bye-bye.